What we're going to do is have fun for roughly the next half hour or so and talk about what medicine was like at the time of the American Revolution, both in the original 13 states and here in the American Southwest. Any presentation that I do perforce has to be rather rudimentary. I'm going to skip over a bunch of things, so you'll probably find that there's some things that you have questions on. I'm happy to answer anything that I do have on there. This is show and tell, which means you can handle anything. And please feel free to hold these up and aim with them. Just don't aim at anybody. Even though they're not loaded, firearm rules still hold. The only thing you have to be careful of is some things are sharp. And the things that you would anticipate as being sharp, like the bayonets, please be careful of, although they're not all that sharp, except some of them are. So be a little cautious with those, and be cautious with the flints on these, because any one of us that has played with these has found that the flints are actually fairly sharp and you can lacerate your thumb on it. We've all done that. So one of the things that I'm going to do, okay, there we go, that'll be better, is to talk a little bit about the uniform. This is the uniform that would have been worn by some of the American Revolutionary troops. If you've seen uniforms, they're all over the place, especially before Washington really declared what kind of uniform he wanted each group to have, when that was about 1778 to 79. Before that time, anything was allowed with one exception: you couldn't wear red. And some troops tried to do that, and Washington sent them a politely worded note that said something to the effect of, "Are you crazy?" On doing it. The other is to tell you a little about the uniform. The felt hat and the tricorn would have been worn by all sorts of soldiers, by the Spanish, by the British, by the Americans, by the French. It's any group is going to wear this. This is a little bit unusual in that it is bound up. Actually, they would have been hook and eye so that you could take that down in inclement weather, and it becomes like a large sombrero. If you notice, I'm not wearing it this way, I'm wearing it like this, and the reason is if you're a soldier, you're shouldering a musket, it's going to be like that, and it's going to get in your way, so it has to be to one side. As a reflection, if you remember hearing about leathernecks, as a reflection of that, there is a piece of cloth around here that looks like a decoration, but originally it was solid leather. That's so the enemy can't lop off your head quite as easily. It takes them a little longer to do that. This one is a little bit less than that. It's just mostly something less, but a little bit of leather on it. Everything else that we would have been wearing at that day and time would have been wool or cotton or linen. And even out here in the American Southwest, even in the middle of summer, if it's 110 degrees, we're wearing solid wool. Heavier than this one. This is American Revolutionary. The Americans would have been wearing something lighter than the Spanish. And I'll be in the middle of this, like when we have the 20 de Agosto celebration, 20th of August celebration for Toussaint's birthday. We're down there as some of the Presidio soldiers, and we're dressed in solid wool, and they say, and we'll have people come up to us and say, "Isn't that hot?" And we'll say, "No, of course not." Actually, wool has some advantages, one of which is, of course, it doesn't catch on fire nearly as much. It might burn a hole if you get too close to some of the sparks from this, but it does not have that kind of danger. The other is that wool, of course, will have the propensity to keep you warm. If you happen to get it totally wet, it'll still keep you warm. So they would wear these winter and summer. The pants are sometimes going to be full length and sometimes knee breeches, and mine are knee breeches, and you can see the socks, and I tell people I'm half Revolutionary War and half Cat in the Hat, because that's what the socks look like, and that's true for the time. They would have been wearing those. The gaiters, you wear these because especially out here, because in the immortal words of John Wayne, everything out here will bite you, scratch you, or stick you. So you have to have something to protect you. The shoes that they would have worn, Spanish, American, any of them, would have been straight last shoes with buckles. Straight last means there's no left or right. They couldn't possibly be bothered with that, which meant that your feet hurt all the time. And they talked about the grim Spanish soldiers. No kidding. That's what they would have done on this, and they would have been wearing those pretty much all the time. So essentially, you would get fairly soft leather shoes like this, and you sort of mold them to your feet, And after a while, it gets to be reasonably comfortable in spite of all of that. Requirements of being a soldier in this day and time. We'll get to Revolutionary War medicine. The first requirement of being a soldier in this day and time, at the time of the American Revolution, is you had to have 2 teeth. One up and one down. Doesn't matter if you have any other teeth in your head, as long as you have those 2, and that's because the cartridges that you're going to be shooting look like this. They're black powder with the ball at one end if you're loading for real, and the first thing you do with your 2 teeth is you tear that off to load the cartridge. And how you load, if some of you might be familiar or might not be familiar with these, is you tear that off, pour some of the gunpowder in the pan, which is there, close the frizzen, that's that piece of metal, take the rest of the gunpowder followed by the ball and ram it down there, and then take the ramrod and run this down like that. And then you return the ramrod using only your little finger. Why only your little finger? Well, the reason is black powder is an explosive. It's not like modern gunpowder, which is a propellant. It is an explosive, which means it has a tendency to go boom. And if you've fired it recently before, especially several times, there might be a little bit of powder or something like there smoldering in the bottom. What's going to happen if you pour more gunpowder in a ball down there? It's going to go kaboom. And if you've just used your little finger, you got 4 more fingers to play with, right? Now you're ready to shoot, and the reason this works is flint is a rock which, when it strikes steel, creates sparks. So when I pull the trigger, sparks would have fallen into the pan. That sets off the gunpowder in the pan. There is a small hole called the flash hole that goes in to the main part of the barrel, and that sets off the main charge. It is not like you've seen the westerns where there's this nice slow train of gunpowder. It's instantaneous. It's like that. Black powder burns very, very quickly. That's basically what the soldiers would do. We have terms that we still use from this time, of course. If I have loaded this totally up there, okay, do that, like that, and I've loaded it, and I'm not ready to shoot right away, I can put it down like this. And if I have a weak mainspring, what will happen at that point is that it could go off, which gives me a warm feeling on the side of my head, and is also probably not conducive to good hearing, and my neighbor doesn't like me very much either, and that's called going off half-cocked, which you've probably heard the term. The second thing that we get from this is that black powder creates a certain amount of residue. I have to clean that out, that flash hole, periodically, or what happens is when I pull the trigger like this, nothing happens. It just goes poof from the powder there. It doesn't transmit it. And that's called a flash in the pan, right? And the third that we still get from the flintlock era is lock, stock, and barrel. What that referred to is the gun lock, the stock, and the barrel, which are the 3 parts of a flintlock musket. So we keep those terms even though this is archaic technology that hasn't been used for 170 years. So much for what the soldier would normally do at this time. What about medicine in this time, at the time of the Revolution? What I'm going to talk about is both medicine and surgery, which were different things, of course, at this time. Medicine was practiced by doctors, and surgery was practiced by barber surgeons. The degree of medicine in Britain today, to the best of my knowledge, is still an MB-BCH, Bachelor of Medicine, Bachelor of Chirurgy, which is the old word for surgery. And if you happen to be treated by a British surgeon and address him as doctor, he will correct you. He is Mr. Because what they took as what was given initially as a sign of disrespect, they have taken as a matter of pride. So a British surgeon would be addressed as Mr. Buxton, Mr. Heptonstall, not doctor at this. This was a time when there was this significant separation that was beginning to break down, but actually was only starting to break down at this time. The theory of medicine that you have to keep in mind that was going on then dates all the way back to Galen and Hippocrates, and it is the humoral theory of medicine. And it pervaded every single belief that people had, including every single thing that was done. All of it was based on the humoral theory of medicine. Humoral theory of medicine is Hippocrates. It was added to by Galen, and it basically says that the four elements, which are earth, air, fire, and water, are reflected in the four humors of the human body. Those are black bile, yellow bile, blood, and phlegm. Phlegm is more than what you have when you have a cold. Phlegm is any clear substance that your body produces. And if you are in balance, that's called krasis in Greek. And if you're out of balance, then you can get ill, and that's called dyskrasis, or condition of that is dyscrasia. The term that we use is a term that Hippocrates would have recognized. It's that old. And it means that you're out of balance with these four humors. So how do you get yourself back in balance? And you get yourself back in balance by various things. You can be purged one way or the other. You can be bled, and the reason for that is because the belief was that blood is in all of the four humors. It is in all parts of the body and other kinds of things, and if you are ill, the most likely problem is an excess of blood. And this is exactly what Galen wrote, and this is what was believed all the way into the 18th century. If you have a major problem, you have to be bled. And how much blood would you actually lose? Well, Benjamin Rush, signer of the Declaration of Independence and one of the founding physicians of the country, said, you ought to bleed everybody until they faint. Other people said that's nonsense. The first person that you try to bleed that way is going to faint at the very sight of the phlegm that you're using. The next person might lose all of their blood. Galen also believed that it was quite reasonable to remove 4/5 of the blood of the human body. Of course, he also thought we had an extra quart that we don't have, so he probably was removing close to 7/8 of the blood of the human body. And what would you use bleeding for? And I'm going to quote. This is from William Buchan, who writes one of the great treatises of the 18th century on this. If you're English, his name is William Buchan. If you're Scots, then his name is William Buchan. And he writes, no operation of surgery is so frequently necessary as bleeding. It therefore ought to be very generally understood. But though practiced by midwives, gardeners, blacksmiths, etc., we have reason to believe that very few know when it is proper. So he tells you when it is proper. Bleeding is proper at the beginning of all inflammatory fevers, such as pleurisy, pneumonias, parapneumonias. It's likewise proper in all topical inflammations, such as those of the intestines, womb, bladder, stomach, kidneys, throat, eyes, etc., and also in the asthma, sciatic pains, coughs, headaches, rheumatisms, the apoplexy, epilepsy, and bloody flux. You know what apoplexy is? Stroke, right? Bloody flux is diarrhea, of course. Dysentery. After falls, blows, bruises, or any violent hurt received either externally or internally, bleeding is necessary. It is likewise necessary for persons who have had the misfortune to be strangled, drowned, suffocated with foul air, the fumes of metals, or the like. In a word, whenever the vital motions have been suddenly stopped from any cause whatsoever, except in swoonings occasioned by mere weakness or hysteric affectation, it is proper to open a vein. Even if you had been shot and you weren't bleeding enough, they would bleed you. It's done for everything. It is interesting to see what they're able to do with this in spite of that, because they would talk about people who would be bled 3, 4, 5 times and still manage to survive. So you had to figure that people were amazingly capable of surviving in spite of what would be done with that. What else would be done? The purging would be done, and you can get an idea of everything going on, because as part of this, any other thing had to do with either cathartics or purgatives or excesses for bleeding. So any of the herbal remedies that would have been used would have been useful for this also. Representative ideas of how medicine was practiced at that can be gotten from a list of the stores that William Henry Harrison asked for Fort Meigs, which is in Ohio, right after the turn of the 19th century. This is about 1800. And what he asked for stores for his troops are as follows. 50 pounds of Peruvian bark. What's Peruvian bark? Quinine. The only antibiotic that they really had, although they used, the belief at that time was also very strongly that certain amounts of deadly poisons were useful, so they would use lead and arsenic and things. 10 pounds of opium. Opium is very interesting. They used it to calm the bowels. They had opium. They had no real understanding of using it for pain relief, but they would use it to calm the bowels. So 10 pounds of camphor, calomel, corrosive sublimate, both of which are mercury, tartar emetic, guess what that's for, and of course ipecac, and they had about 17 pounds of that were required. Jalap, which is interesting. What is jalap? Well, if you understand that jalap comes from the province of Jalapa in Mexico, the other thing that we get from that, of course, is the jalapeno. You can get an idea of what that would have been used for as well. And 12 gallons of castor oil. Now, it wasn't all bad because they had 300 pounds of chocolate, but they did have this huge amount. Everything was to be purged all the time. How many remember either being purged as a child or being told that this was something that needed to be done? Do you remember hearing of these things? My mother, in the year 1917 in rural Kentucky, contracted typhoid fever along with her sister. And the doctor told them, and I quote, "There may be more modern ways of treating this, but I don't know them. I'm going to go with what I've always used, which is castor oil." Every day she got a dose of castor oil, and she got that for probably the better part of a month. After a while, she couldn't keep it down, so they gave her a shot of bourbon after the castor oil. And she said for years thereafter, the smell of bourbon made her nearly, feel like she was about ready to throw up. But she said she got over that. So she was able to use bourbon quite well without any problems with this on doing it. In spite of this, so how would you bleed people? How would you actually do? So to do this, I've got to take this off, and I'm going to show you how bleeding was done on this. It takes me a while to get all of this off, with apologies. There was also a theory at the time that bleeding needed to be done right close to the area so if you had an inflammation of the mouth, they bleed you in the tongue. They would find a vein there that they would do. But others realized that, oh no, it doesn't make any difference. After all, we're very scientific. We understand Harvey and the circulation of blood, but we still believe in the humoral theory of medicine on things. So essentially what you would do is that you would have somebody, and these are bleeding bowls, by the way. This is for a large one. The barber surgeons would be the ones that would be doing this. At the time of the American Revolution, it was starting to break down a little bit, but this is how they would do. So I have here an ancient Spanish bandana, and you're a scout. So wrap that up and tie it pretty tight right around here. Gee, we could hear a pin drop. Oh, you're being way too tight. No, I'm too loose. Tight. Really tight. There you go. That's good enough. And I say I've got some nice veins. So you would have your assistants. Come here, Dr. Hammett, you're the assistant. You can hold on to that. And these are phlegms. Now you could use a scarifier, which is outside in the display case out there. That also works. But depending on the depth of the vein you wanted to access, you could use a fairly deep one or a light one of this. And what you would do is, this is also sharp, is that you would pass that there. Great. And then you would open that by just pressing in that way, and you would take a certain amount of blood. Now, most times when I do this, I have people looking away saying, oh gosh, he's really going to do it. You all know better. No, I prefer to have my blood where it is, actually. But you would bleed into that area, or wherever you had that was there. Medicine was very interesting at the time. It was practiced more as a cottage industry, as an apprenticeship. There were something like an estimated 3,500 physicians in the colonies at the time of the American Revolution, some 120 of whom had actually had university training. However, that didn't necessarily mean that much, because you could go through and get all of the latest theories and all of the latest information and philosophies on that, and you would never once see a patient. The training at that time thought that was essentially irrelevant. You might come to somebody and feel their pulse. They, of course, didn't have stethoscopes. They didn't have other kinds of things to be able to tell. They weren't interested in this other than whether it was strong or thready. And if it was strong, then you clearly need to be bled. Other people were putting down this to say, how would you bleed them and how long, how much? Well, you would bleed them until I should give a little bit of an aside. At the time of the American Revolution, they were starting to break down some of the humoral theory. Boerhaave said it's not really the four humors, it is an excess or a deficiency of alkalinity, acidity, it's something like that. But it essentially mounted to the same thing. You still tried to get things back into balance. And Cullen had come up with the idea that it's an excess or a deficiency of nervous energy. And his disciple was Benjamin Rush, who wrote back to him even after the revolution saying he'd converted most of the physicians around him into believing that this was absolutely true. An excess or deficiency of nervous energy. So you can imagine that if you'd been shot and you're not dead, you might have a sharp bounding pulse because it tends to make you excited. And they would feel this rapid pulse, this bounding pulse, and say, oh, they need to be bled. How much? Until this sharp bounding pulse is weaker and calmer. We call it shock. But that was the belief that was essentially there at the time. In spite of the belief that was there, it's amazing what they did have, because remember, this is after Morgagni with pathologic anatomy, this is after Harvey, this is after Leeuwenhoek, whose cavorting beasties they could see, but they knew perfectly well that tiny little things like that couldn't possibly harm anybody. And so they knew a lot of these things. It also is the time when scurvy was treated by Lind, with the realization that if you gave citrus fruit to people, that they wouldn't develop scurvy. So it was a great story that was on this. That's why the British soldiers, of course, are called limeys on this, that they realized that it wasn't. The Spanish soldiers in this area got scurvy until they realized that the Indians didn't. And the reason the Indians didn't, they realized, was because they would eat the fruit of the prickly pear or the pads of the prickly pear, both of which are high in vitamin C, and they wouldn't get this disease. So they followed that practice, and they were able to do quite well with it. Variolation starts in about 1713 with Lady Wortley Montagu, who had suffered a terrible attack of smallpox herself. Smallpox is a speckled monster. It killed any number of people. There was a great outbreak in Boston in the early 1700s. And she had realized that if you used a small amount of the pus from this and gave it to people or put it inside their body by scratching or introducing it actually even into a vein, that they would get a case of smallpox, but it would be a much lighter case. Variolation was so controversial that Zabdiel Boylston and Cotton Mather, trying to promote this in the 1720s in Boston, nearly got themselves lynched by mobs in Boston at that time. It was still controversial at the time of the American Revolution, but Washington realized how important it was, very strongly insisted that all of the soldiers have variolation, and a smallpox epidemic that started at Valley Forge really never got that far because he had gotten enough of them to be vaccinated. Don't believe that biological and chemical warfare are new. What happens also, if you have somebody who has this, if they are then exposed to somebody who has never gotten smallpox, they can get the full-blown case of smallpox. So they are infectious. And the British, during the time of this, would send people with new variolation out into the American held areas in hopes to start a smallpox epidemic. It's documented. This is in Boston, 1775. Not only that, but when the Americans took over, hope there are no British sympathizers here, when the Americans took over Boston after they took it back from the British, they found that the stores of the apothecary shops, all of the various herbal remedies had been liberally dosed with either arsenic or antimony. So biological and chemical warfare are not new. It was still a major devastation, and there was a huge smallpox epidemic from 1775 to 1783. In spite of that, they still were able to do things, and there was still a reasonable amount of science. It was fascinating to see the dichotomy, because they would not get rid of the theory of bleeding people. I thought it was back at the time of Cook's Principles. This is like about 1840. In actuality, my understanding is that Sir William Osler's book on the practice of medicine, dated 1923, I believe, still lists bloodletting as a reasonable thing to be done in some instances. This dies hard. It's still there. The belief is still, to some extent, that people will still have on this. Some of the things that they would do would be also interesting. To renew the breathing, this is Buchan again. A strong person may blow his own breath into the patient's mouth with all the force he can, holding his nostrils at the same time. When it can be perceived by the rising of the chest or belly that the lungs are filled with air, the person ought to desist from blowing and should press the belly and breast so as to expel the air again. This operation being repeated for some time, alternately inflating and depressing the lungs so as to imitate, what are they doing? CPR. This is 1700s that they're able to do this. Though cold was by no means the cause of a person's death, yet it will prove an effective obstacle to his recovery. For this reason, after stripping him of his clothes, he must be rubbed strongly for a period of time. They're demonstrating that this be done, and get him warm so that hopefully he will start doing things again. They're doing CPR without knowing what it is in the 1700s. So it wasn't totally without logic. And if you think humoral theory is without logic, think again that there is a certain amount that's there. If you have somebody that is hot and dry, example would be a high fever, you treat them with cool and wet. It makes a certain amount of sense. How many herbal remedies have you seen, or herbal things, including Ayurvedic medicine, really still have very much this kind of basic theory? Surgery is a totally different matter, of course. Surgery was done by the barber surgeons. They were not educated people. Many of the physicians were not either. But surgery was done by people who really had come from the barber surgeons. Now, you remember the founder of surgery is Ambroise Paré, who realizes that the belief at that time was that gunshot wounds were automatically infected, and that to treat this, or not infected, excuse me, they didn't believe in infection per se, they believed that they were automatically poisoned, and therefore to get rid of the poisons produced by the introduction of the bullet into the body, they would pour boiling oil down the wound, thus converting an already dangerous wound into a third-degree burn and producing all manner of other kinds of things. And his realization was essentially, stop doing that, you'll get a lot better. Paré was, of course, the one who said, God heals, I only assist. It had gone some distance, because we're now getting to the point where we're at John Hunter, and they had basically major accomplishments. They really did have a significant understanding of anatomy, and they would suture wounds. They didn't have the kind of suture that we have now, but they would try things, and they realized very quickly that spun gold and silver didn't work very well. So they wouldn't be using those, but they would use certain kind of animal fiber, and they would use silk. And so they were able to do this, and there are treatises extant that talk about even suturing the bowels, with the apparent understanding that even some of these were actually able to be survived. There was no understanding of germ theory, of course, but they did understand some degree of cleanliness would be there. That only went a certain distance. If you as a surgeon had much better results than someone else, it had nothing to do with the fact that your instruments were clean. You just happened to be in a better place. And they did have some understanding of contagion. You would look forward with any kind of wound to the development of laudable pus. Every wound gets infected. That was considered a good sign that it was going to, that your body was going to be throwing off whatever was in there. So with a gunshot wound or anything of that nature, they would try to open things up at both ends. If it was a through and through wound, they would go and try to get the ball if they could reach it. But basically, if you have any kind of infection or any kind of wound, they would try to look forward to its developing pus, and that was a good sign of what they would do, might survive that. At the time in 1776, what would be your experience if you were a Revolutionary War soldier? In 1776, 1,000 died of wounds, 1,200 had wounds that they didn't die of, and 10,000 died of disease. These statistics retained all the way until the 20th century. It is only in the last 100 years that we have become more adept at killing our fellow human beings than disease was able to. But all during the time, an estimated 35,000 Americans died at the time of the American Revolution, and it was about 3,500 from wounds and the rest of them from disease. Which diseases? Malaria was endemic all the way up the coast into New England. My understanding is that malaria was endemic in the San Pedro River Valley until the 1930s in Arizona. It is not an old disease. Typhus and typhoid. These are powerful diseases. They did not fully understand them. If you developed a rash, incidentally, that was considered of no importance at all if it was different from another rash. So the rash that you might get with epidemic typhus versus typhoid might not be paid any attention to at all. Typhus, incidentally, is one of the more powerful diseases in history. If you don't know that this had a part to play, the great defeat that Napoleon had in the Russian winter was as much due to epidemic typhus, if not more, as it was due to the having to withstand the cold of the Russian winter. And the reason that Napoleon was willing to sell the Louisiana Purchase to Jefferson for $15 million was that they had had terrible experience with typhus in Hispaniola, which is Dominican Republic and Haiti. And their understanding, Napoleon's understanding, was that New Orleans was very much the same. Everyone was yellow and sick, and he figured the whole inland part of that was not worth anything, totally uninhabitable, and so why not give it to this rube from the colonies? And so he was willing to sell it for $15 million. But part of the reason that's written down there, and there's documentation on it, was he really considered that it was uninhabitable land because of the prevalence of disease. Yellow fever was markedly, everyone was terrified at this, but yellow fever actually was mostly in the deep south and only epidemics. They wouldn't have that much. In the summer, you would get dysentery and malaria. In the winter, of course, respiratory diseases. Certainly they understood some degree of contagion. They didn't understand what it was for, but they did. Public health really began to be practiced as a result of the requirements of Benjamin Rush and also by von Steuben when he comes over. And one of the things that he starts doing is talking to people about the responsibility of soldiers. For example, you're going to put the sick people off in one area. You're not going to mix them all together. If they're sick with one kind of thing that they could sort of tell, try to keep them separate from the others. Smaller hospitals are better than bigger hospitals where they're all breathing the same air and all getting the same contagion. Wash every 3 days. The latrines are downstream, thank you very much. And believe me, they believed in dedicated privies because the soldiers on guard duty, if you were faced with somebody who had the temptation in the middle of the winter at Valley Forge to just sort of lean out the tent and go pee, they were liable to be shot. And they said this on there. In other words, you had to go and use the latrine, and they very, very strictly enforced the rules on trying to keep people clean. It was amazing, but the American Revolutionary Army was a very clean army. You would bathe every 3 days. You would drink from the middle of the stream. Itch. I've heard of the 7-year itch for years. Scabies, right? I didn't know what it referred to. I thought it just meant that the itch lasted that long. It refers to the 7 Years' War, which we call the French and Indian War, because that's when scabies really made its appearance. And they could see the bugs. They knew that if they looked closely enough with a glass, they could see them. The cause had been known by the Arabs from the 11th century. They'd been able to see the scabies mite. No, it has to be because they're out of balance. They need to be bled. So it's a very pervasive belief. Injuries, gunshot wounds and bayonet wounds. What created the wounds? This is essentially a Brown Bess musket. The Brown Besses were 75 caliber. They're muskets rather than rifles. The size of the ball is going to be slightly smaller than that, like about 0.73 inches. This is one of the ones that was used by the British against us and by us against them. It is soft lead. See if I can find one here. It's like this, and it's just about 3/4 of an inch. This is what they fired. For those who are interested in ballistics, Dr. Marks, the ballistics on this is that at about 120 grains of black powder to 150, this has probably a muzzle velocity a little over 1,000 feet per second and a muzzle energy of about 1,000 to 1,100 foot-pounds. So it's comparable to modern weapons in many instances. It will go in like this, but it's soft lead. And so when it comes out or it goes in there, it's going to expand. It's going to be like this. And they have some that are about that size. The ones used also in this area were the Charleville muskets. Charleville was used by France and Spain and given by both France and Spain to the American Revolutionary troops. This is 69 caliber. Again, it's a musket, not a rifle. Rifles they had, but the very nature of a rifle says that you have to get very close to the tolerances has to be close to the bore, so they're much harder to load. An experienced musket owner with this, or soldier with a musket, can load and fire about once every 15 seconds, which is amazing. With a rifle, it's about once every minute and a quarter. So it takes a lot longer. Washington initially was so amazed at the skill of the riflemen, though, that he put them right in the front, and the difficulty was that the British would overrun them by the time they could reload. So they learned to use them as sharpshooters for other things. These are basically the weapons that were used at the time of the American Revolution. They had some rifles, but not very many for the reasons stated. They would create a huge wound but low velocity. Therefore, you wouldn't get the explosive effect of the temporary cavity that modern gunshot wounds produce, because they're much more rapid and because you get this explosive expansion of a temporary cavity. Example would be the M16 is 3,100 to 3,200 feet per second. The M14 that preceded it was 2,400, and the M1 is about 1,900 feet per second. This is about 1,000. So they would be able to survive even abdominal wounds, surprisingly. Not many, but they were able to do it. The other thing, though, is if you had a major bone injury, they would try to save you, but frequently they would try to get the ball, and this would be what you would use to get the ball. This has a small cavity in there, and you can use this. You would feed this into the wound in the person and get it around the bullet and pull that out. However, if it's embedded very far, then you can't get it or you can't get it out. Then what you do is you feed this into the wound, ram it against the ball. Now you can imagine that there is no such thing as an anesthetic at this time. And you're pushing as hard as you can, and you ram that into the soft lead, and you screw that in like this. And this is how you would retrieve a musket ball at that time. And then you pull that out. If it's worse than that, and you have to do an amputation, which happened further, I'm going to use Dr. Hammett again. Come here. When I had him feed that on, this is what you would. This was invented by Jean Petit, who was a Frenchman. It was a far better thing that you would do. You would place this tourniquet tighter. You're being very nice. You would place the. Yes, I'm right. I can afford to lose one. You would place this as tight as you can. If it is not tight enough, you're going to bleed, right? So you can tell if you start doing this. You place this basically 4 inches above the area, or 4 finger breadths above the area where you're going to do an amputation. This is an amputation knife, and the thing that you do is that you take this and you run it all the way around like this. You pull the skin back, usually with a leather strap attached onto the bone, so that you can separate the muscle from that. You take an artery hook like this, tie off the arteries, each one of those, and then you use a bone saw. Hold on to this, Linnell. Stand up and show them what you're doing. Now she's holding it. That's the bone saw, and you would go through, an experienced surgeon could go through this in about 40 seconds, could do a full amputation. They had to go fast because there's no such thing as an anesthetic. Now I'll remove this. And the reason is that if any kind of, they had opium, they didn't understand what to use it for. It was fascinating that they would do. I'll have you take that off too if you can. Anesthetics. What is?
How are they tying the arteries?
Suture. They have suture. They're tying them off, and then they cover it with lint on this area. And after 2 days, they go back and very carefully pull off the suture. And if they've done a good job, it doesn't bleed. Then it's already clotted off, and it does that. Amazingly, 35% of people on average were able to survive a major amputation on doing this. What was your anesthetic?
Did they use cautery?
They did sometimes, but not with arteries, not with that kind of tissue. It didn't work as well, so they used mostly by tying it off. They did use cautery with other kinds of things. With certain kinds of boils or infections, they would use it. You've heard the term bite the bullet. People have said that's old wives' tale, but they found these with teeth marks in them, so they know this was used. If you were lucky, they would give you brandy or give you something to do for that. But frequently, this was the only thing that they would have for doing this, which basically leads you to an understanding that there are 3 potential uses for these balls, which we can pass around if people want to see what they're like. And this is what they would have fired on there. Some of these are original. First one, of course, is you can kill your enemy with it. The second is you can use it as an anesthetic. And the third is the medicinal use. Do not go to your doctor and complain of constipation. They would do this. They would say, well, if you're constipated, I know what to give you because, believe me, it'll find its way through on doing this. So those are the 3 uses of musket balls that were there at the time and able to be used for that. Sorry? Did it work? Yeah, it worked. Or at least the patient would never come back to complain on doing that. Bayonets, not as sharp as the ones that we have now. You can tell the way I'm handling this. This is not sharp, and the reason is the physics of it is that this is not a slashing weapon, it's a thrusting weapon. This was used because usually they would fire once or twice and then fix bayonets and charge the other side. And if you figure the logic of it is, this doesn't have to be that sharp, because if all of your weight is behind it on the end of the musket, it's going to go in if it's there, and especially if you're way up into this area, it's going to go in very easily. It is 3-cornered for 2 reasons. One is, strongest shape geometrically is a triangle. Second reason is that they wanted to create a 3-cornered wound. 3-cornered wound, if you're stabbed and you're not killed, the wounds are going to come together fairly easily, right? If a 3-cornered wound is created, they can't come together nearly as well. Therefore, it stays open longer, it's more likely to get infected, they have no antibiotics. And as I explained to people, it wasn't personal, they didn't want to hurt you, they just wanted to kill you. This is the weapons that were used at the time on there. How different was it here? America was very different. If you were in this spot in the 1700s at the time of the American Revolution, this is part of Spanish America. The founding of Tucson is 1775. So we're right contemporary with that time. Had you been here at the time, the people that you would have seen would either been Spanish soldiers or Indians. And very little difference in the basic understanding. However, there were a wealth of herbal remedies that were being used in this area, and the Spanish, with great avidity, went after these. There is the report that Columbus sent back to Ferdinand and Isabella, I guess was who he was doing this for, but he sent this back saying that he was sorry he hadn't really gotten to know the Indians on Hispaniola well enough to be able to get their herbal remedies. Well, that's because he killed them all. But there are wonderful stories. There are things written back. Cortez, when he conquers Mexico, sends a report back to the King of Spain saying, don't send doctors, we have better ones here. There is a whole street in Tenochtitlan, Mexico City, which is devoted to herbal remedies. Sahagún in the 17th century writes an 8-volume treatise on the life and the experience and the practices and the herbal remedies of the Indians. Unfortunately, he leaves out anything that talked about the gods, because that was against the rules if you were a good Catholic. So he leaves out a certain amount, but a lot of this was still used, filters down, and is very definitely done. And surgery in Spain was much more highly regarded. 1768, before the founding of Tucson, the King of Spain, who is Carlos III, is very much a Renaissance king, founds a medical school in Mexico City. This is contemporary with the two that are founded here, what became the Medical College of Philadelphia, and King's College, which became Columbia. Actually, I think it predates one of them, but he specifies that you are to teach medicine and surgery to all doctors. They are not to be taught separately. Here in Tucson, we have on good authority, which is Father Ignaz Pfefferkorn, that there were no doctors in the whole province of Sonora. So for the Spanish soldiers and the Spanish Presidio troops, I'm their barber surgeon at this point. And my knowledge is as good as we get. So I can bleed people, but I'm not going to do much more. You understand, of course, the reason the barber poles have the red and white stripes is they were the barber surgeons at the time. Up here, I stole some of the stuff from the Presidio presentation, and it gives you a little bit of an idea. You can take a look and see what is Old World, what is New World, and some of it is rather surprising. Aloe, for example, everyone presumes is New World. It's not, it's Old World. A lot of the basic herbal remedies and thoughts of this were very avidly taken by the Spanish and used. There's a wonderful treatise by Pfefferkorn again, who speaks of that he had no respect for the Jocotillo plant because all it was is stickers and thorns and had no possible use, until one of his troops, one of the Spanish soldiers with him, suffers a severe crush injury, has a huge leg. The Indians with him say, don't worry about that, and they take a bunch of green ocotillo and mash it up and sort of boil it or cook it a little bit, apply it to the leg, and they said within a day it was as good as new. A lot of this is done on the basis of that was there. So Tucson probably functioned quite well by only having a barber surgeon and not an honest-to-goodness doctor, because he would have simply added the latest theories and bled them more. In summary, this was a period of relative intense development of knowledge both in medicine and surgery, but while medicine was ending up in an intellectual cul-de-sac, surgery was developing rapidly based on observation and experience, and the unfortunate fact that surgical knowledge, at least, increases rapidly during times of war. Thank you very much. I have some of the things that the troops would have used, either the Spanish or American, that were here. Incidentally, if you read the list of the Spanish soldiers that were here at the time, Tucson's founder, of course, was Don Hugo O'Connor. Doesn't sound very Spanish. Faith and Bigorra, his name was Hugh O'Connor, and he found it prudent to leave Ireland, probably with the English after him, and you go directly south, where in due time his name becomes Hugo O'Connor, and he's one of the troops of Spain. But there were other troops not as well known, because along with the Ramirez's and Martinez's and Quirogas and others, you find names like Carroll and Miller. The Irish went everywhere. They were called the wild geese. The Presidio, if you happen to go down there when we're doing the presentation, they've got all of these out and they're really good. The best book on healing with plants, of course, is Margarita Kay's on this. She's local, and she's the one that did all of the really profound work on doing this. There's some wonderful other books there. When I was in the military, I was told in no uncertain terms my body belonged to the government, and that's exactly what they would do. However, it's very interesting what they would do. One of the real reasons that you did not have as widespread use of variolation was that people still believed through the Middle Ages and into the 18th century that disease was God's judgment upon you. And if you did anything to alter this, this was against the will of God. And there was a certain group of the British soldiers who refused to have variolation, even though they accepted the premise that it was good, because it was interfering with God's will. These were called conscientious objectors. That was the origin of the term. It had nothing to do with being against killing. It had to do with not wanting to disobey the will of God toward getting disease. And because they were much more likely to get diseased, they didn't want them in the front lines. So they kept them back, and that's why the term conscientious objector meant that at that time you were kept away from combat. Had nothing to do with any compunction about killing. So they did understand that there were certain things that soldiers would not do, but not for the reasons we think.